Shalom and welcome to the ministry of Yeshua. I'm so glad that you're here. Today we're diving into this week's portion, which is Vayera. We will be exploring its wisdom, its beauty, and how it speaks to our lives right now. Together we'll look at the passages from Genesis 18:1 through 22:24, which will connect us to 2 Kings 4:1 through 37, as well as Luke 17:28 through 37. And the portion summary is as follows. In Vayera, the angel of the Lord appears to Abraham in the guise of a wandering stranger, along with two other strangers who are angels as well. Abraham entreats the traveler to enjoy his hospitality, not realizing who they are until one of them declares that Sarah will have a son 1 year later. Sarah overhears the conversation and laughs. The two accompanying angels depart to Sodom to see if its wickedness is sufficient to merit extinction. Abraham negotiates with the angel of the Lord to spare Sodom, where his nephew Lot lives, finally reaching an agreement that if 10 righteous men can be found in the city, it should be spared. The angels, however, do not find 10 righteous men. The city is destroyed, but Lot and his daughters are spared. Lot's wife, however, is transformed to a pillar of salt. Lot's daughters assume that humanity has been wiped out, and to save the human race, they intoxicate and seduce their father. And they give birth to the Moabites and the Ammonites. The nomadic Abraham settles in the Philistine territory, where his wife Sarah is abducted for the harem of King Abimelech. God warns Abimelech that he will die unless he returns the woman to her husband. At the age of 90, Sarah gives birth to Isaac. He is circumcised on the 8th day. Ishmael mocks Isaac. Sarah demands that Ishmael and Hagar should be sent away. So Abraham sends them away. God reveals a well to them and saves their lives. The Philistine king Abimelech makes a covenant with Abraham at Beersheba. God tests Abraham by commanding him to sacrifice Isaac. Abraham obeys. But as he is about to sacrifice his son, the angel of the Lord rescinds the command. Abraham offers a ram in Isaac's instead, and travels back to Beersheba. So what is Vayera? The fourth reading from the book of Genesis is named Vayera. It means, and he appeared, because the first story describes how the Lord appeared to Abraham one day as he sat outside his tent. Parashat Vayera continues with a series of tests of faith for Abraham, concluding in one great and final trial. Faith tested. The life of faith is a life of testing. At every juncture, we are tested. Passing each test requires stubborn optimism, resolute confidence in God, and steadfast obedience. Life's problems are opportunities to prove our faith and to improve our faithfulness. We fail life's tests when we give in to despair, lose confidence in God, or turn away from obedience. Every difficulty and trial is a test of faith. Will we assess the problem through the eyes of faith or not? Will we respond in faith or faithlessness? Abraham endured many such tests. The apostles remembered him as a man of faith. But what is faith? The writer of the book of Hebrews has an answer for us. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Hebrews 11:1. We sometimes misunderstand this definition as if it's meant that faith is simply believing in something. In English, faith is always a noun. It's not something you do. For Abraham, faith was something he did. The Hebrew word we translate into English as faith is imunah. Also has a verb form. Faith also implies faithfulness. Abraham was a man of faith in that he believed in God's promises, but he was also a man of faithfulness in that despite all the adversity and trial, he remained faithful to God. Clement, the disciple of Peter, asks, why was our father Abraham blessed? Was it not because he brought about righteousness and truth through faith? 1 Clement 31:2. And Clement sees the performance of the righteousness as the natural result of Abrahamic faith. In another passage he states, Abraham, who is called the friend of God, was found to be faithful because he was obedient to the words of God. 1 Clement 10:1. The writer of the book of Hebrews reminds us that it was by faith Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance, and he went out, not knowing where he was going. Hebrews 11:8. When he arrived in the land, his faith was again tested. Though God had promised to give the land to Abraham's descendants, Abraham himself lived as a nomad. By faith he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents. Hebrews 11:9. In the previous Torah portion, we learned that Maimonides considered Abraham's journey to Canaan as his first great test of faith. The second test of faith came when he arrived in the land only to face famine. The third test occurred when his wife Sarah was abducted in Egypt. The fourth test was the war with invading armies. The fifth test was the long wait for the promised son and his marriage to Hagar. And the sixth test was the commandment of circumcision. In this Torah portion, we will follow the story of Abraham through the remaining four tests of faith, which are the abduction of Sarah by Abimelech, the exile of Hagar after she gave birth, the exile of Ishmael, and finally the sacrifice of Isaac. The Jewish people are the physical and legal descendants of Abraham. Gentile believers are also descendants of Abraham in a spiritual sense. Abraham is the father of us all, Romans 4:16. Together we form the family of Abraham. As children of Abraham, we are to follow in the steps of faith of our father Abraham, Romans 4:12. Because it is those who are of faith who are sons of Abraham, Galatians 3:7. And those who are of faith are blessed with Abraham, the believer, Galatians 3:9. Now this can be compared to a man who had two sons, one natural and one adopted. Because they were both raised by the same father and in the same household, they both behaved like their father and their lives reflected his values. In this Torah portion, we will learn more about what it means to live out both the faith and the faithfulness of Abraham, our father. Mysterious visitors. Now the Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre, while he was sitting at the tent door in the heat of the day, Genesis 18:1. Abraham was sitting outside of his tent during the hottest part of the day. Under the shade of a tree, he was trying to catch a little bit of a breeze. He saw three strangers passing by on the road below, despite the heat and the inconvenience. Abraham sprang up and chased them down to invite them home for a meal. Now, by inconvenience here, this was actually the third day after Abraham's circumcision. And as many of you may know, the third day is one of the most painful days. So despite the pain, despite the heat, he still rushed to them to offer them some hospitality. Who were the three mysterious visitors? We later find out that they are angels, but one of them speaks directly on God's behalf and is referred to as the Lord himself. The Lord often appears to people in the Bible in a form known as the angel of the Lord. The angel of the Lord appeared in various angelic forms. In this text, he appeared to Abraham as one of the three travelers. In the book of Exodus, he appeared to Moses as a burning bush. In the wilderness journey, he went before Israel in the pillar of the fire and the cloud. When the angel of the Lord speaks, he speaks for God in the first person and identifies himself as the Lord. Now, is the angel of the Lord God, or is he simply an angel sent by God? Many Christian commentators have reconciled this difficulty by explaining the angel of the Lord in terms of Old Testament encounters with Yeshua. The suggestion is that whenever the angel of the Lord appears in a text, it is actually a visitation by Yeshua. Perhaps in some mysterious respect, there is some truth to this, but Yeshua is not the angel of the Lord. After all, the angel of the Lord is an angel. Yeshua is a man, made for a little while lower than the angels, but now crowned with the glory and honor, and appointed over all things, even above the angels. When Abraham hurried out to greet the strangers, he did not realize that they were angels. He thought they were just common wayfarers. He ran to meet them, bowed before them, greeted them, and entreated them to enjoy a meal with him. His exceptional hospitality is a model for all godly people. Clement, the disciple of Peter, suggests that one of the reasons that Abraham merited the birth of Isaac was the exceptional hospitality that he showed to the mysterious visitors. Clement says, because of Abraham's faith and hospitality, a son was given to him in his old age. 1 Clement 10:7. We should show the same enthusiastic hospitality to people who pass near our tents. By imitating our father Abraham, welcoming people into our homes and communities, serving them and showing them kindness, we demonstrate the love of God. We should treat each person we encounter as if it might be the Lord Himself. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by this some have entertained angels without knowing it. Hebrews 13:2. Imagine the Messiah disguising himself as a stranger and visiting your home or your congregation. How would he be received? Hungry angels. He took curds and milk and the calf which he had prepared and placed it before them, and he was standing by them under the tree as they ate. Genesis 18:8. Now, in the practice of traditional Judaism, meat and milk are not eaten together. Traditional Judaism interprets the commandment that says, "You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk," Exodus 34:26, to mean that meat and dairy cannot be mixed or even eaten together at the same meal. In Messianic Judaism, we often argue about whether or not meat and dairy separation is the real original meaning of the commandment in Exodus 34:26. Naysayers point to Abraham serving the curds, milk, and freshly slaughtered calf to the three strangers as evidence that meat and dairy separation is not really a biblical idea. Traditional Judaism, however, counters by explaining that Abraham served them milk and curds while the calf was being slaughtered, butchered, and cooked. Several hours later, he served them the meat. Actually, the argument is irrelevant since the Torah had not yet been given. But the rabbis had another question about the food. Do angels eat? The sages of the Talmudic age taught that the angels do not eat. 6 things are said of human beings. They have 3 things in common with the ministering angels, and 3 things in common with animals. The 3 things they have in common with the angels are that they have understanding like the ministering angels, they walk erect like the ministering angels, and they can talk in a holy tongue. For example, Hebrew, like the ministering angels. The 3 things they have in common with animals are that they eat and drink like animals, they reproduce like animals, and they relieve themselves like animals. That's from Hagigah 16b. Like the sages, Yeshua taught that angels do not reproduce. We may safely assume that they also do not eat or relieve themselves. But if that is the case with the angels, how is it that Abraham served them and they ate his food? The sages explained that the angels only pretended to eat. They seemed to be eating and drinking, the courses disappearing in order of arrival. In other words, while Abraham stood by, they made the appropriate chewing motions and miraculously dematerialized the food. Rashi says they only appear to eat. From this we learn that a person should keep the local custom as not to be offensive. This can be compared to visiting a synagogue or a church. In a synagogue, it is customary for a man to wear a yarmulke or a kippah on his head. Visitors to the synagogue would offend their host by refusing. In churches, however, it is customary for men to have their heads uncovered. Visitors to a church would offend their host by refusing to remove their hats. We should be willing to adapt to our surroundings so as not to create an offense. The concept that angels do not actually eat food explains a mysterious passage in the Gospel of Luke. When the resurrected Yeshua appears to his bewildered disciples, they first assume that he must be a ghost or an angel. To prove that he is really human, he asked for some food to eat. While they still could not believe it because of their joy and amazement, he said to them, "Have you anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it before them. Luke 24:41-43. She laughed within herself. Then they said to him, "Where is Sarah your wife?" And he said, "There, in the tent." Genesis 18:9. Abraham still did not realize that the strangers were angels. He probably was not surprised that the visitors seemed to know something about him and his family. He was a man of some means and reputation. When they asked him, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" it was reasonable for Abraham to assume that these strangers had heard of him and knew the name of his wife. When one of them said, "I will surely return to you at this time next year, and behold, Sarah, your wife, will have a son," Genesis 18:10, Abraham knew that these strangers were not ordinary visitors anymore. He had been entertaining angels unaware. While her husband Abraham was conversing with the visitors, Sarah was listening from the inside of her tent. Her ears must have perked up when she heard her name mentioned. When she heard the birth prediction, she laughed to herself, Genesis 18:12. Who can blame her? She was elderly and far beyond her childbearing years. Now the stranger whom Abraham realized to be an angel of the Lord asked, "Why did Sarah laugh?" Genesis 8:13. Sarah denied that she had laughed. It had been a private thought. The Hebrew says she laughed within herself. It was not possible that anyone had heard her. Now when Sarah denied laughing, she was not lying. She really had not laughed aloud. God, however, hears even the thoughts of our hearts. "I did not laugh," she said, but the Lord said, "No, but you did laugh indeed." Genesis 18:15. God hears even the thoughts of our hearts. We cannot hide our feelings from Him. In hope against hope. Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I have become old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord, being old also?" Genesis 18:12. Sarah had good reasons to laugh. Both she and her husband were too old to have children. Nevertheless, Abraham believed the promise. After being rebuked for her silent laughter, Sarah believed it too. The writer of the book of Hebrews says that it was by faith even Sarah herself received the ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Hebrews 11:11. Now there was a friend that we know who recently, or I guess we can say once, he met a couple in a similar situation. And we'll call them Nancy and Jim. Nancy could not have children. Though she and her husband have tried various doctors and medical solutions, nothing seemed to work. Nancy felt like the barren woman of the Bible. The Bible tells us several stories about women like herself who desperately wanted to have children but were unable to conceive. Nancy felt like a failure. However, she was not hopeless as Sarah had been. Nancy was in her early 30s and she had something Sarah did not have. Nancy had the story of Sarah. She had all the stories of the Bible, and she believed them. She had hope in a God who answers prayers. When the opportunity rose for Nancy and Jim to travel to Israel with the first fruits of Zion, Nancy's heart leaped with hope. She remembered the story of Hannah, another barren woman who had been unable to bear children, but received an answer to her prayers when she prayed at the tabernacle. In the holy city of Jerusalem, Nancy and Jim went out to the Western Wall, an ancient retaining wall that holds up hillside on which God's holy temple used to stand. Nancy and Jim went to the wall to pray for a child. With tear-filled eyes, Nancy tucked a little slip of paper containing her prayer into the wall. Although Jim and Nancy Israel tour had been hosted by the Ministry of First Fruit of Zion, the person had not gone along that tells us this story. At the time, he was not yet working for the ministry, and he met Jim and Nancy and their month-old son a year after their trip to Israel, and they told him this story. And now I'm telling you this story. And it's very interesting because many people who went to the Western Wall and who put some slips of the papers of special prayers and everything that they've asked of our God actually came true. Many stories, thousands of stories. So if there's a certain prayer request that you have or anything that you're struggling in your life currently, or you really read some certain prayers to be answered, even for somebody that's not yourself, traveling to Israel and going to the Western Wall is a fascinating experience, and I hope every one of you should give it a try. Is anything too difficult for the Lord? Is anything too difficult for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return to you at this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. Genesis 18:14. Now Abraham and Sarah believed in God's promise. In the book of the Romans, Apostle Paul writes about the Abraham's unwavering hope and confidence in God. Let's take a careful look at that passage. Abraham believed God, who gives life to the dead and calls into being that which does not exist. In hope against hope he believed so that he might become a father of many nations according to that which had been spoken in Genesis 15:5. So shall your descendants be. Without becoming weak in faith, he contemplated his own body, now as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, and the deadness of Sarah's womb. Yet with respect to the promise of God, he did not waver in unbelief, but grew strong in faith, giving glory to God and being fully assured that what God had promised, he was also able to perform. Therefore, as it says in Genesis 15:6, it was also credited to him as righteousness. Romans 4:17-22. Now Abraham believed the impossible. He believed that his wife would conceive and bear a son. Not only did he believe the impossible, but Paul says that Abraham's faith did not waver in unbelief, but grew strong, fully assured. And why is that? According to the Romans 4:17, Abraham trusted God to fulfill his word because he knew two things about God. He knew that he is the God who gives life to the dead, and that he is the God who calls into being that which does not exist. Now Abraham was as good as dead. His wife's womb was dead, but that did not matter because God gives life to the dead and calls into being that which does not exist. Sarah believed, and her ability to conceive was restored. God resurrected the bodies of Abraham and Sarah, so to speak, so that they could bear children. Now the sages of Talmud explained that at the moment Sarah laughed, the Lord miraculously restored her body to that of a young woman. He brought her womb back to life. That day her menstrual cycle returned, her flesh was rejuvenated, the wrinkles were smoothed out, and the beauty returned to its place. That's from B. Baba, Metzia 87b. You might be skeptical about that tradition, rightfully so. The story does not say that Sarah's youth and beauty returned to her. However, we will see some evidence supporting this traditional legend in Genesis 20. For now, let's suppose it did happen. What does this teach us? It teaches us the basis for hope, that there is no reason to despair when we have faith in a God who gives life to the dead and who calls into being that which does not exist. Yeshua, the ultimate Son of Nazareth, demonstrated both of these principles. Miraculously, he conceived by a virgin. He demonstrated the power of God who calls into being that which does not exist. Resurrected from the dead 3 days after his crucifixion, he demonstrated the power of God who gives life to the dead. Through faith in him, our souls, which were as dead as Sarah's womb, are quickened and brought to life. It's called being born again. Like Sarah, we are restored from the inside. Abraham pleads for Sodom. Now Abraham came near and said, "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" Genesis 18:23. Why did God send 3 angels? Would not one have been sufficient? Rashi explains that each angel had a different job. One to bring glad tidings to Sarah, one to overturn Sodom, and one to save Lot. After enjoying Abraham's hospitality, the 3 angels rose to continue on their way towards Sodom. Abraham walked with them. The angels of the Lord told Abraham about the mission to Sodom and Gomorrah. He was sending the other 2 angels to see if the people were wicked enough to merit extinction. The 2 angels of the Lord bound for Sodom continued on their way, but Abraham remained standing before the angel of the Lord to plead for mercy on behalf of Sodom. Abraham was motivated to intercede for Sodom and Gomorrah because his nephew Lot lived in their midst. Moreover, Abraham was a man of compassion. He did not desire to see the death of the wicked. As children of Abraham, we should be the first to come to the defense of others. Rather than calling down judgment, curse, and condemnation on sinners, the godly person prays on behalf of the sinner and intercedes for his well-being. Once in the days after the apostles, the famous Rabbi Meir was troubled by some bandits who lived in the area. He prayed that God would smite them, but his wise wife, Beruria, overheard his prayer. She rebuked him and said, "You should instead ask God to bring them to repentance." Meir agreed and changed his prayer. Shortly therefore after, the bandits repented and became students of his at the study hall. Abraham's negotiation tactic is simple. He holds God to his own standard of justice, saying, "Far be it from you to do such a thing, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous and the wicked are treated alike. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly?" Genesis 18:25. The Lord relents and allows that if 50 righteous men can be found in Sodom and Gomorrah, he will not overturn the cities. Having established the principle, Abraham negotiates the price down to 10 righteous. The haggling sound like a typical Middle East business transaction. However, not even 10 righteous were to be found in Sodom and Gomorrah. The sin of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, as Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. Genesis 19:1. The story of how the citizens of Sodom welcomed the two strangers gives us the impression that inhabitants of their city were judged for their illicit sexual sins. Homosexual acts are referred to in English as sodomy. Engaging in homosexual relations is a grievous sin before God. He calls it an abomination. Jude, the younger brother of Yeshua, explains that Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed because they indulged in gross immorality and went after strange flesh. Jude 1:7. But sexual depravity was not unique to Sodom and Gomorrah. It's still with us today. And we don't see fire and brimstone falling out of the sky onto today's centers of immorality. Were there other sins and vices charged against those cities? From ancient times, there have been different theories attempting to identify the real problem in Sodom and Gomorrah. The Talmud preserves a list of opinions that includes charges of sexual immorality, stinginess, blasphemy, avarice, selfishness, burglary, encroachment, extortion, and injustice. Several of these sins may be derived from a passage in the book of Ezekiel, where the prophet metaphorically refers to the kingdom of Judah as Sodom. "Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had arrogance, abundant food, and careless ease, but she did not help the poor and needy. Thus they were haughty and committed abominations before me. Therefore I removed them when I saw it." Ezekiel 16:49-50. Now the prophet Ezekiel lists sexual immorality as the final straw after an accumulation of social injustices. Ezekiel charged the people with enjoying abundant food and careless ease, while neglecting the poor, a charge that could be leveled against most of us living in the West. An old Jewish tradition claims that primary sin of the men of Sodom and Gomorrah was their inhospitable welcome of strangers. Consider the contrast between the godly Abraham and the wicked people of Sodom. When Abraham saw the strangers, he leaped up and ran out to meet them, gave them the best provisions of his household, and served them personally. Lot, a man of the house of Abraham, treated them in an almost identical manner. He rose to meet them, bowed before them, invited them in, prepared a feast for them, and baked bread for them. Now the people of Sodom, however, were outraged with Lot and demanded that he surrender his guest to their wicked designs. That's not very hospitable. Jewish legend embellished the story with other tales of how badly the people of Sodom treated guests and strangers. The people of Sodom came to represent the opposite of hospitality. Not only were they sexually deviant, but even worse, they were inhospitable. Clement, the disciple of Peter, followed the Jewish explanation in that he also saw hospitality and inhospitality as the main issues in the Sodom and Gomorrah story. On account of his hospitality and godliness, Lot was saved out of Sodom when all the country round was punished by means of fire and brimstone. The Lord thus maketh it manifest that he does not forsake those that hope in him, but gives up such as depart from him to punishment and torture. 1 Clement 11:1. Yeshua was and may be alluding to the hospitality explanation for the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah when he tells his disciples to seek hospitality in the homes and villages they enter. He tells them, "Whoever does not receive you, nor heed your words, as you go out of that house or that city, shake the dust off your feet. Truly I say to you, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city." Matthew 10:14-15. Judgment and the final judgment. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. Genesis 19:24. Now the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was meant to be a warning. Peter says that God condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to destruction by reducing them to ashes, having made them an example to those who would live ungodly lives thereafter. 2 Peter 2:6. Now the Apostle Jude says that Sodom and Gomorrah destruction by fire and brimstone was exhibited as an example in undergoing the punishment of eternal fire. Jude 1:7. In other words, what happened to the people of Sodom in this world will happen to the wicked in the afterlife. Yeshua told his disciples that a city that did not welcome them and show them hospitality would face harsher judgment than Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment. In another passage, he said that it will be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than it will be for the inhabitants of Galilean villages of Chorazin, Bethsaida, and Capernaum, the cities where he performed most of his miracles and delivered most of his teaching. From this we learn that there are two different judgments for human beings. There is a judgment in this world, such as Sodom and Gomorrah endured in Genesis 19, and there is a final judgment in the world to come. The inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah will face yet another judgment on the final day of judgment before God. So will the inhabitants of those Galilean villages and all of humanity. Yeshua says that in the final judgment the wicked people of Sodom will fare better than the people of Galilee. How can this be? Are the Galileans comparable with the depraved people of Sodom and Gomorrah? Yeshua explains that if he had performed the same miracles in Sodom that he had performed in the local villages of Galilee, the people of Sodom would have repented and their cities would have remained to this day. Matthew 11:23. Now the people of Galilee, on the other hand, had witnessed his miracles and for the most part had not repented. This can be compared to two children who got out of bed in the night. The father spanked the first one and put him back in bed. He took the second one and warned him that if he didn't get back in bed, he would get the spanking too. Now the second one, however, ignored the warning and did not get back in bed. The next morning the father summoned both children to the woodshed. Which one do you think got the more serious spanking? Sodom is like the first child who was punished and not warned. The villages of Yeshua that he spoke in are like the second child who was warned but not punished. Therefore, in the final judgment, the people of Sodom and Gomorrah will be judged less severely because they did not have the same opportunity to repent. Yeshua illustrates the principles in another teaching. He says that the matter can be compared to two slaves. Both of them failed to do a certain job that their master wanted accomplished, but only one of them knew about the responsibility. When the master returned to check on their progress, he was dismayed to see that the job was not done. Which slave did he punish more severely? And that slave who knew his master's will and did not get ready or act in accord with his will receive many lashes. But the one who did not know it and committed deeds worthy of a flogging will receive but a few. From everyone who has been given much, much will be required. And to whom they entrusted much, of him they will ask all the more. Luke 12:47-48. Remember Lot's wife. But his wife, from behind him, looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Genesis 19:26. The Apostle Peter tells us that the righteous Lot was oppressed by the sensual conduct of the men of Sodom and his righteous soul was tormented day after day by their lawless deeds. Nevertheless, Lot was reluctant to leave Sodom. The Torah attributes Lot's rescue to Abraham, saying, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of midst of the overthrow, Genesis 19:29. Now the angels compelled Lot and his family to flee from Sodom, dragging them by the hands, and they told them, escape for your life, do not look behind you, Genesis 19:17. As they fled, however, Lot's wife looked back and became a pillar of salt, Genesis 19:26. Why did she turn to salt? Now the regions of Sodom and Gomorrah is in the area of the Dead Sea, also known as the Salt Sea. The Dead Sea is famous for an extremely high salinity. The shores of the Dead Sea are frosted in salt deposits. Because she turned into a pillar of salt, the natural salt of the Dead Sea area became a reminder of Lot's wife for the generation to come. Now there's also another story regarding this. Why did she turn into a pillar of salt? So when the angels came to Lot, it was actually Passover, which is called Pesach, and they were eating matzah. And the story goes that the angels asked for salt, and supposedly Lot's wife refused to give them the salt. She said, what is this silly tradition of salt? And she refused to give it to them. So at the end, she turned into a pillar of salt. Yeshua often warned his disciples about the troubled times to come. Now he foresaw days of persecution, the coming destruction of Jerusalem, and catastrophic day of judgment at the time of his second coming. He warned his disciples that at the time of his second coming, people will be caught up unaware and unprepared. They will be like the generations of Noah, eating and drinking, marrying and carrying out with normal life, when disaster suddenly overtakes them. Then they will be like the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, utterly unprepared for the moment of judgment. It was the same as happened in the days of Lot. They were eating, they were drinking, they were buying, they were selling, they were planting, they were building. But on the day that Lot went out from Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them. It will be just the same on the day that the Son of Man is revealed. Luke 17:28-30. Yeshua warns us all that in the times of distress and tribulation, we must be ready to let go of our things, our hopes and our plans in an instant. We need to be able to let go of everything without turning back as Lot's wife did. He says, remember Lot's wife, whoever seeks to keep his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life will preserve it. Luke 17:32-33. Now he was referring to literally fleeing for one's life in a time of tribulation and cataclysm. But his warning also carries an important spiritual lesson. Lot and his family were nearly swept up in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah along with the rest of the inhabitants. They nearly died in fire, not because they were wicked like the rest of the city, but because they had allowed themselves to become attached to the place and the people. They did not indulge in all the vices of the material culture around them, but neither had they maintained a healthy distance from the culture. When it came to time to flee, they found that they could not let it go. The angels had to drag them from the city, and even then, Lot's wife could not help but look back. Now Clement, the disciple of Peter, comments on the story of Lot's wife and says, for Lot's wife who went forth from him, being of a different mind from himself and not continuing in agreement with him, as to the command which had been given them, was made an example of, so as to be a pillar of salt unto this day. This was done that all might know that those who are of a double mind and who distrust the power of God bring down judgment on themselves and become a sign to all succeeding generations. 1 Clement 11:2. Now, it is easy to let comforts and mundane things of everyday life lull us into the sense of complacency. We tend to cling to the material world. Its busyness, pleasures, and concerns distract us from the matters of spirituality and godliness. If we cannot let go of the materialism, we will be double-minded like Lot's wife, and we may well perish with it in the day of judgment. Now, disciples of Yeshua are to be in the world, but not of the world. That's a very important point. Lot's daughters. Thus, both the daughters of Lot were with the child by their father, Genesis 19:36. The most shocking and disturbing moment in the Sodom and Gomorrah story occurs when Lot offers his two virgin daughters to the marauding band of perverts outside his house. Fortunately for the girls, the man of Sodom rejected the offer. Lot's disregard for his daughters, however, returns on him. Thinking that the entire earth has been destroyed and that they are the sole survivors, Lot's daughters set out to save the human species by means of inebriating their father and impregnating themselves by him. Just as he was willing to give up his daughters up to shame and dishonor in order to save his own life and the lives of his guests, he suffers shame and dishonor at their hands. Their sons, Moab and Ben-Ami, became the ancestors of Moabites and the Ammonites, neighboring nations on Israel's borders. Parents today sometimes unwittingly follow Lot's example when we fail to protect our children from the immoral culture we live in. By allowing them to be exposed to media, internet, entertainment, literature, peers, friends, and social groups that reflect the secular culture's sexually deviant values, we sacrifice them like Lot's daughters. As was the case with Lot, the shame comes back on us. I have often heard people complain about parents who overprotect their children. If a hungry lion was loose in your home, would it really be possible to overprotect your child from it? Wouldn't you do everything possible to keep your child away from the lion and the lion away from your child? Yet your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. 1 Peter 5:8. The seventh test, Sarah's second abduction. Abraham said of Sarah his wife, "She's my sister." So Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah, Genesis 22. We often face the same test time after time. Whether some difficulty, a weakness, a temptation, or uncertainty, it seems the matter keeps coming back. Now this is normal. If we meet those recurrent challenges with persistent faith, they build character and perseverance. However, we sometimes face the same test over and over because we keep failing it. If we continue doing the same thing wrong, we can expect to keep getting the same result. In the previous Torah portion, we learned the story of the abduction of Sarah. While in Egypt, Abraham feared that the Egyptians would kill him for his beautiful wife, so he claimed that she was his sister. As a result of the ruse, Pharaoh had her abducted for his harem. She was saved only through a miracle of God. Apparently, Abraham was not willing to rely on God when it came to the safety of his life, but he seemed to be content with relying on miracles when it came to the safety of his wife. He seemed more concerned about himself than Sarah. Now, the same situation arises in Genesis 20. When entering the territory of the Philistine king of Gerar, Abraham thought, "Surely there is no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife." Genesis 20:11. He told everyone that Sarah was his sister. Now remember the Jewish tradition we read about earlier, how God miraculously restored Sarah's youth so she could bear children? The fact that Abraham was worried about his wife being stolen suggests that this may have been the case. After all, Sarah was 90 years old at that time. Why would King Abimelech abduct a 90-year-old woman for his harem? Perhaps she didn't look like a 90-year-old woman anymore. She must have been very beautiful. God smote Abimelech's household with a plague and appeared to Abimelech in a dream, warning him that Sarah was married. Abimelech returned her to Abraham and rebuked Abraham, saying, "What have you done to us? And how have I sinned against you, that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me things that ought not to be done." Genesis 29. Now, Abraham was wrong about his assessment of Abimelech's people. They possessed a fear of God or gods and a fear of sin, and they respected the boundaries of marriage. Abraham had failed to trust God, and he had failed to give Abimelech's people the benefit of the doubt. Don't be too quick to judge others or declare them godless, because the Lord may be working in their lives in ways that are not readily apparent on the surface. We should always be willing to give others the benefit of the doubt. Did Abraham pass or fail these tests? He failed them in that he did not trust God to protect him and he exposed his wife to danger. But he passed them in that he did not lose hope in God. Why does the Torah tells us about Abraham's failures? The Bible relates the failures and the weaknesses of its heroes as well as their strengths. It should be encouraging for us to see that even a great man of faith like Abraham wasn't perfect. There is hope for us too. Now let's talk about giving birth to Lapher. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, who Sarah bore to him, Isaac, Genesis 21:3. The Hebrew word for Lapher is tzechok. When God told Abraham that he would have a son through his elderly wife Sarah, Abraham laughed. And Lord replied, Sarah your wife will bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac, Yitzchak, Genesis 17:19. Isaac Yitzchak means he will laugh. When Sarah heard the prophecy that she would bear a son within the year, she laughed to herself. A year later, holding her baby son, she said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. Genesis 21:6. The result of faith is joy. Though the journey of faith may lead through many dark and difficult places, the final destination of laughter is joy. Ninth test, sending Ishmael away. Therefore, she said to Abraham, drive out this maid and her son, for the son of this maid shall not be an heir with my son Isaac. Genesis 21:10. Now Sarah was not the only one laughing. The Torah tells us that Ishmael also laughed, though not with joy. Ishmael was jealous and he laughed with malice. Genesis 21:9 says, Now Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, mocking, metzachek. The word for mocking, metzachek, is built on the same verbal root as the word for laughter, tzechok, and the same name, Isaac, Yitzchak. In this story portion, we have seen laughter express incredulity and ridicule on one hand, and joy and wonder on other. Laughter can be employed for good or for ill. When Sarah saw Ishmael ridiculing Isaac, she demanded that Abraham send Hagar and Ishmael away. Now Abraham's first inclination was to refuse. It did not seem to be the right thing to do, but then unexpectedly God endorsed the plan. He told Abraham, do not be distressed because of the lad and your maid. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her. Genesis 21:12. Thus Abraham faced his ninth test of faith. Could he trust God to care for Hagar and Ishmael? Did he trust God's promise to also bless Ishmael and make him into a great nation? Did he trust God enough to trust his wife Sarah? The ninth trial contained each of these tests, but it was also a preparation for the 10th and biggest test of faith that Abraham would face. The trial over his son Ishmael prepared him for the final test, the commandment to sacrifice his beloved son Isaac. Abraham passed the test. He rose up early in the morning and sent Hagar and Ishmael on their way, with a skin of water and supplies for the journey. God opened her eyes. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and she went and filled the skin with water and gave the lad a drink. Genesis 21:19. Abraham gave Hagar and Ishmael a skin of water for their journey. They set out for Egypt and apparently lost their way. In the heat of the wilderness, a day without water is almost certain death. Hagar despaired and prepared to die. She prayed that she might die first, so that she would not have to see Ishmael die. God appeared to her and reminded her of his promises regarding Ishmael. Then he opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. The well had always been there. In her despair, she had not seen it. Her dependency on Abraham is symbolized by the water skin he gave her. When that water was exhausted, she despaired of life. So too, when sent out of the household of Abraham, she gave up hope. Her despair blinded her to God's provision and plan for her life. Dependency and despair are impediments to faith. We cannot rely on one another's person's faith or relationship with God. We must depend on God. When all seems bleak and blanketed in despair, we need to open our spiritual eyes and look for God's provision. 10th test, the ECHAD of Isaac. Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am, Genesis 22:1. The 10th test, and which is the last and greatest test of Abraham's faith, was the commandment to sacrifice his son Isaac as burnt offering. In 19 stark verses, a dark and unsettling story unfolds, a story that leaves more unsaid than it says, and that inspires more questions than it answers. It is the story of the sacrifice of Isaac. The story of Abraham's attempt to sacrifice Isaac is sacred to Jews and Christians alike. No other narrative from the scripture is so often read, recited, and prayed over. Now, the devout Jews recite the story of the binding of Isaac before prayer every morning. The binding of Isaac is also the synagogue Torah reading for the second day of the holiday called Rosh Hashanah, which is the festival of trumpets. And to that its occurrence in the regular Sabbath reading cycle. And this biblical narrative is read and meditated upon 367 times a year in synagogue. Judaism calls the story of Genesis 22 the ECHAD, and the ECHAD means binding. The word ECHAD is derived from the Hebrew word akad, which is translated as bound in Genesis 22:9. Christianity highly regards the story of the binding of Isaac as well. Christians teachers have always seen the ECHAD as foreshadowing the death and resurrection of Yeshua. Just as Abraham was willing to sacrifice his only begotten son, God also sacrificed his only begotten son. Lech lecha. And he said, Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering, one of the mountains of which I will tell you. Genesis 22:2. When God first called Abraham, he said, Go forth from your country. The Hebrew for go forth is lech lecha, as you remember. That was the first test of Abraham's faith. Near the end of Abraham's life, Lord again tells Abraham, Lech lecha. He commands him to bring his son to Isaac to the land of Moriah. The land of Moriah is the area of Jerusalem. God tells Abraham to bring Isaac to one of the mountains of which I will tell you. The Mount Moriah is the mount on which King Solomon built the Holy Temple. Abraham built his altar on the very spot, the same spot where the Holy Temple would one day be built. Abraham did not object to God's commandment. Instead, he rose early in the morning to carry out the terrible duty. Remember that he also rose early in the morning to send out Hagar and Ishmael? When we have a commandment from God, even if it seems disagreeable, we should not procrastinate. Abraham passed the test. He demonstrated his confidence in God. When Isaac asked about the lamb for the sacrifice, Abraham confidently replied, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. Genesis 22:8. He demonstrated he was willing to sacrifice Isaac, even binding him, placing him on the altar, and taking the knife to slaughter him. How could a loving father do this? The writer of the book of Hebrew explains, by faith, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. It was he to whom it was said in Genesis 21:12, In Isaac your descendants shall be called. He considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. Hebrews 11:17 and 19. Abraham believed God with such absolute faith that he did not hesitate to obey. He knew God had made promises to bless and multiply his seed through Isaac, and he knew God would keep those promises, even if he had to raise Isaac from the dead. Behold a ram! Then Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the place of his son. Genesis 22:13. When Abraham demonstrated that he was willing to obey God even at the cost of his beloved son, the Lord sent his angel to stop the sacrifice. Then Abraham saw a ram provided by God to offer in the place of his son. Even though the sacrifice of Isaac was interrupted and Isaac was spared, it is still reckoned to Abraham as if he had actually sacrificed his son. Clement, the disciple of Peter, says, as an act of obedience, Abraham offered Isaac as a sacrifice to God on one of the mountains which he showed him. 1 Clement 10:7. Not only was Abraham willing to sacrifice his son Isaac was also willing to be sacrificed. Jewish tradition insists that Isaac cooperated willingly with his father because he wanted to obey God. Clement also relates this piece of Jewish tradition about Isaac when he says this: Isaac, with complete confidence, as if he knew what would happen, gladly offered himself as sacrifice. 1 Clement 31:3. Faith of our Father. Because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Genesis 22:16. Now the story of Abraham is the story of faith tested. Abraham passed the test of faith. The rabbis compared God's 10 tests of Abraham to a potter testing his pots. A potter does not test defective pots because even a single blow will break them. What kind of pots does he test? Only the sound vessels, for he will not break them even with many blows. Similarly, the Holy One, blessed be He, does not test the wicked, but only the righteous. As it says in Psalm 11:5, the Lord tries the righteous. Genesis on Rabbah 55:2. Faith is more than just believing. Faith is also doing. When Abraham proved his faith by obeying God's command, God said that He would bless Abraham and keep His promises to him because he obeyed. In the days of the apostles, people had already begun to misunderstand Paul's message of salvation by faith. They thought it meant that we only need to believe. Obedience to God is not important. So as long as we believe the right things. James, the brother of Yeshua, disagreed. He said, faith, if it has no works, is dead. Show me your faith without the works, and I will show you my faith by my works. James 2:17-18. The real faith requires faithfulness. The real faith results in obedience. James used the story of Abraham as an example. He said, was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up Isaac his son on the altar? You see that faith was working with his works, and as a result of the works, faith was perfected. And the scripture was fulfilled, which says in Genesis 15:6 that Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, and he was called a friend of God. You see that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone. James 2:21-24. Abraham is the father of our faith. If we truly walk in the faith of Abraham, we can expect to be tested in that faith. Every time we obey God, we prove our faithfulness. And Abraham, our father, was tested with 10 trials, and he withstood them all, demonstrating how great was Abraham's love for God. Abraham, our father, peace be upon him. Now that's from Avot 5:3. And that's about it, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If this message blessed you, please like the video and subscribe. It does help a lot with the message to reach more people who need encouragement and the truth. And feel free to follow our Instagram, linked in the comments for a daily inspiration. May God bless you and keep you. May He shine His light on you and be gracious to you. May He turn towards you and grant you peace.